Variables are a very important part of any good science experiment. A variable is any factor that can change. It can be as big as a change in the way you're doing things, or as small as a change in the type of material that you're using. All variables, big and small, are going to have an impact on your experiment, and so it's very important to think before you start about how you're going to control any variables, any factors that could change that might get in the way of the results that you are trying to generate. There are three important kinds of variables that I want you to understand a little bit more about. The first of those kinds is called a controlled variable. The second is called an independent variable, and the third is a dependent variable. Now, try as we might, there are going to be some times where we encounter variables that we just can't control. They're things that are outside of our ability to adjust. And if this is the case in an experiment that you're about to do, it is important to still identify those things. Don't just pretend they don't exist. Identify them so that when you get to that point where you're ready to make your conclusions and analyze your data, you can take them into consideration. So the first of our three types of variables is called a controlled variable. This is a variable that is going to stay the same the whole way through your experiment. This is one of the only times in life where it is totally okay to be a control freak. You want to control the controlled variables in your experiment as completely and as well as you possibly can. If you control these controlled variables, you'll notice that the results you see are really all about pointing to the one thing that you allowed to change. Some things to consider as you're trying to decide what variables in your experiment need to be very intentionally controlled. Think about things like time and temperature, how long you're going to be doing different parts of your procedure for duration. Also technique, how are you going to be doing all these things? The materials that you're using, even down to the brand or the bag or container that you're pulling from, and amounts as well. So for example, if I were to conduct an experiment where I wanted to test which made better cookies, using butter in my recipe or using margarine in my recipe, I want to control a whole lot of things as I'm preparing my procedure. I'm going to want to control things like the amount of time that my cookies are in the oven for. I want them to be in the oven for the same amount of time. I want to control things like what temperature my oven is set at when I put those cookies in to test them. I want to control how long they're going to be not just baking, but also how long they're set out on the counter as dough before they go into the oven, or do I put the dough in the fridge for a little bit? I want to control the technique that I'm using both to mix my batters, to make my dough, and to put my dough onto the trays. I want to think about how I am doing and interacting with all the parts of my experiment. I want to think about the materials that I'm using. If my experiment is all about which works better in a cookie, butter or margarine, I shouldn't change the brand of flour that I'm using. I don't want to change the type of baking soda. The only thing I want to change in my recipe is margarine or butter. Also consider amounts. You want to make sure you're using the same amount of everything except for that one variable that you have identified that you want to know more about, that one variable that you want to change. An independent variable is the one variable in your experiment that's going to change. So in the example of my cookie experiment, the one thing that I allow to change is whether or not I'm using butter or margarine in my recipe. I'll have one set of cookies ready to come out of the oven that were made with butter, and one set of cookies ready to come out of the oven when I'm done that were made with margarine. Everything else about the experiment will look exactly the same, but I have butter in one set of cookies and margarine in the other. That's my independent variable. If I change more than that one thing, let's just pretend that I changed the amount of flour in my recipes and I changed butter versus margarine. Now when I pull my cookies out of the oven, I might see a big difference between batch 1 and batch 2, but I'm not sure whether the change happened because I adjusted the amount of flour or whether the change happened because I adjusted butter and margarine. This is why it's really important to only change one independent variable in your experiment. Now, that's not to say that you can't go back later and do a new experiment where you leave the butter or margarine the same and now only change the flour. But you have to test one thing at a time. Your independent variable is going to be decided before you even get to your experiment, because as you're planning your experiment, you're going to have to come up with a question first, or you need to come up with a hypothesis, which is a guess, an educated guess as to what you think is going to happen. Those two things will help you to decide which one variable you want to change. A dependent variable is going to change because of your independent variable. So in the case of my cookies, because I changed the butter and the margin in my recipes, as a result, I will likely notice a difference in the way my cookies look when they come out of the oven. Changing butter and margin was my independent variable. The way the cookies look is the dependent variable. That's the result of my change. Usually, the independent variable is going to show up in your data. So the thing that changed because of your independent variable will be your data. And then again, there will be times where we can't control everything that we might want to in an experiment. This is okay as long as we acknowledge that that's what's going on. We have to consider that as we're analyzing our results. So what I would like you to do now is to think about our experiment with the germs or bacteria that we were trying to wash off our hands using soap and using just water. Think about how we set that experiment up, and I'd like you to make a list of all of the variables we controlled. I'd like you to make a list of all the variables that we didn't control, and then I'd like you to think big picture. Really, what was the one thing that we wanted to change? What was our independent variable? And because we changed that thing, what changed as a result? What was our independent variable? That's a lot to think about. So I will leave you to it. Please write your list in the bell ringer. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.